Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Historian with Heritage Mississauga. I'm Matthew Wilkinson. Each week, we invite you to send in your stories, your curiosity, things you've pondered about or been wondering about, and we look forward to exploring the history of this place and delving into those tidbits of the past with you each week here on Ask a Historian. So please keep the questions coming, and we really enjoy exploring the history of this place with you. Our first question this week involves the old Showboat that used to be down in Port Credit. And for those long-term residents in Port Credit, many of you may remember the old Mark Twain riverboat or Showboat. It was known, the floating restaurant at the foot of Helene Street in Port Credit. There was indeed an old Showboat or Mississippi riverboat, if you will, docked at Port Credit between 1976 and 1982, and it was known as the Mark Twain Showboat, or to some in terms of local advertising, the Mark Twain Riverboat Restaurant. It was well, landmark's the wrong term, a watermark, if you will, but a really visible element along the shoreline in Port Credit for at least a few years. Before delving into what happened to the boat, let's take a look back at a little bit of its history. It was a stern-wheeler steam towboat that was built originally in 1896 in Pennsylvania, and originally served on the Mississippi River in the St. Louis area as originally a tugboat, or what was known as a towboat for barges. It looked a little different than the Showboat appearance when it came to live in Port Credit for a time. When she was built, she was originally known as the James Y. Lockwood, and she served under that name until 1927, when she was sold and transferred to Natchez, Mississippi, where she served as a transfer barge on the Natchez and Southern Railway. The James Y. Lockwood continued to serve an operational history until 1961, eventually transferred to the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and again used as a rail transfer boat. In 1961, an entrepreneurial spirit, a businessman from Chicago named Joseph Salon, purchased the retired James Y. Lockwood from the Missouri Pacific Railroad Company, and brought the boat under its own steam, and at least one reference says this is the last time the boat sailed under its own steam. This is in 1961. Brought the boat to Chicago, where after extensive renovations and alterations, including making a larger promenade deck and enclosing portions of the boat, converting the interior, the newly created interior, into a dining salon and a nightclub. It was opened as a floating restaurant and nightclub on the wharfs of Chicago in 1963 under the name Showboat Sari S. Sari S. The Sari S was sold and transported to Buffalo in 1970, where she was renamed the Mark Twain, and again served in Buffalo as a floating restaurant. Only have a short life in Buffalo, operated as a restaurant for about 5 years. And in 1976, the now christened Mark Twain Showboat was purchased by Renko Pekatich, I believe is the pronunciation of that, and Tony and Steve Shurik, who brought the boat to Port Credit, where it served as a 500-seat floating restaurant. And it served, it was a restaurant operating in Port Credit between 1976 and 1982. In 1982, it was sold to Horst Herbstreit of Mississippi Holdings Limited, which was actually a Canadian company. And the boat was then towed out of Port Credit. It left Port Credit on August 17th of 1982. And there are some recollections that have been shared to us of the boat departing Port Credit, perhaps even with a little bit of a list to it. And eventually it was transported aboard a carrier through the St. Lawrence and brought to a dockside in New York, where it was intended to be reopened as a restaurant in New York. That plan never materialized, and the boat became tied up in a legal case between the Dutch shipping company Memoet and New York City and the boat owner, principally around dockage fees and permits and the like. But the court action transferred the ownership of the boat to Memoet, which was a Dutch company. And finally, in 1989, the much deteriorated Mark Twain, or former Mark Twain, was transported across the Atlantic Ocean to Amsterdam, where it was intended to be refitted as a restaurant. The shipping file on this boat, in terms of being certified as a boat, I guess in those terms, was closed in 1985. To date, we do not know the current status of the boat. We know that it departed New York in the summer of 1989 aboard a Dutch carrier. To date, I have not been able to find out what became of the boat after that. I have inquired with Memoet. I haven't got a response on that as well, or as of yet. So perhaps in a future issue of the Ask a Historian, we can explore maybe what has become of the Mark Twain. But nonetheless, the Mark Twain, a well-traveled and historic boat, although not always a showboat in its history. It was a working tug for much of its early life, later converted in the 1960s to the showboat that we came to know here in Port Credit. But birthed at Port Credit between 1976 and 1982, the Mark Twain Showboat, or the Riverboat Restaurant, a waterfront restaurant here in Mississauga for at least a short period of time. So thank you for the question. Truly a unique part, if short-lived part of our history here in Mississauga. Our next question for Ask a Historian revolves around Emancipation Day and its connections, I guess largely in the sense in Canada, but also locally as well. Emancipation Day had a number of steps leading up to it, things that happened in sequence that paved the road for eventual emancipation and abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies in 1834. In 1793, Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe here in, what is now Ontario, then Upper Canada, passed a bill for the gradual abolition of slavery in Upper Canada. It was not a perfect solution, but it was, in a sense, baby steps in the right direction. The essence of the 1793 bill that was passed here in what is right here Ontario, but what was then Upper Canada, were that any men and women currently enslaved as of 1793 would stay that way until their death. So anyone in the province that are currently enslaved would remain enslaved. However, children born to any slaves after 1793 would be free after the age of 25, and most importantly on this, no new slaves could be imported. That was the border for slavery was closed for the acquisition of new slaves, at least in legal practice, and there was a step towards a gradual freeing of those born into captivity. Again, it was far from satisfactory. We can, in hindsight, look back and say it was steps in the right direction, but there was a long way to go in terms of the eventual abolition of slavery. Percolations throughout the British Empire. Of course, Canada at the time is but a British colony. Our major policies are not made here by local government, but are made by the Colonial Office overseas. There were movements towards an anti-slavery approach or an abolition of slavery in the British Empire in the years leading into the late 1820s and early 1830s. On August 28th, 1833, an act for the abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies was passed in British Parliament. That was 1833, but it did not take effect for almost a full year. The date that act became legal or became law was August 1st of 1834, and that's the date that we connect to in terms of the anniversary of the abolition of slavery, not only in Canada but also throughout the British Empire and the British colonies. So August 1st, 1834, the British government government, by way of that act, freed all slaves within the empire and outlawed slavery. Also, as part of that act, they compensated those who had owned slaves but would lose that labor, if you will. So it was an act not only to abolish slavery, but to provide for opportunities for freed former slaves, but also as compensation for those that gave up slavery or gave up slaves that they had once owned. At this time, by 1834, Upper Canada, what is now Ontario, only had a very small number of slaves. Some resources have said somewhere between 50 and 75 individuals were still enslaved as of 1834. This was in large part due to the 1793 Act that had been passed by Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, again, leading kind of towards this eventual abolition of slavery. Incidentally, the first place in the British Empire to pass a bill that would see to the gradual abolition of slavery in 1793. With the abolition of slavery in Upper Canada, indeed throughout all British colonies, you began to see the gradual and over time accelerating movement of former and fugitive slaves out of what was the continental United States into British areas of British control, in the sense that they offered freedom. It does not mean that this place was without racism and prejudice. Those are much harder things to, historically speaking, and even in light of today, to overcome. But by legal standards, there was an opportunity for freedom within the envelope of British rule. Again, there was what is seen as to be a relatively small number of slaves at the time that the 1834 Act abolishes slavery throughout the empire. It's this date, though, however, October 1st of 1834, that we connect to as the anniversary of the abolition of slavery. Incidentally, the Toronto Caribbean Festival, Caravana, also connects to that date of that anniversary in terms of its event that's taking place. And in that segue, or that jump, if you will, in our narrative, I really encourage anyone interested to check out the virtual online presentation of the Toronto Caribbean Festival taking place this weekend through July 28th to August 3rd, I believe. But check out them online. There's a number of virtual things that are going on in light of the challenges that we face with COVID this year, of ways to connect not only to the anniversary of the abolition of slavery or Emancipation Day, but also the ongoing cultural festivals that connect to the celebration of African Canadian and Caribbean culture within Canada, so and across the world. So really encourage anyone to check out that festival this weekend. It looks to be an amazing time, and again, unfortunately virtual this year, but nonetheless we can still celebrate and connect to these vibrant cultures that help make up the mosaic of life here in Canada. So thank you. Our next question this week from Lindsay is around the name of Todoraka Park in northwest Mississauga. There is a leash-free park in northwest Mississauga, affectionately known to locals as Toto Park. It is again a leash-free park for dogs, so perhaps Toto is an appropriate reference. But the full name, Todoraka Park, and Todoraka Park has an interesting story in terms of its name and its origins. And some people have over time asking about Todoraka. What's its name origins? Is there a Japanese origin to our sister city of Korea, Japan? Is there an indigenous origin? And with a slight smile, the answer to both of those inquiries is no. Todoraka isn't really a word. It's a grouping of letters put together to create a word, and what it actually stood for was Toronto Township Recreation Day Camp. So if you take the first two letters out of each of those words, Toronto Township Recreation Day Camp. you come up with todoraka. So obviously in its origins was not a leash-free park for dogs. It was a day camp, a summer day camp for children. The camp was the brainchild of the early Toronto Township Recreation Department, particularly under Director Jerry Love, created in the early 1950s. The camp operated in the late 1950s into the 1960s when the name was adopted, and they had a number of locations. The camp idea wasn't set in a singular geography. It moved around quite a bit. There were camps held in Arundel Park. There were camps held up at what is now the Meadowville Conservation Area, and it was some time before kind of a permanent home was found for the park. That was until 1973, when a new home along with some facilities were built around what is now Dairy Road West and then known as Fifth Line, just north of Dairy Road, and this creation, this day camp creation, was born in a physical location. The present site of Todoraka Park was located just north of this original. It is located just north of the original property that was created in 1973 to house the park. The 1973 park closed in 1985 when Todoraka, as a functioning entity from the city of Mississauga, moved to Meadowville Conservation Area, and it in turn ceased in 2004. Use of the name Todoraka for day camps in Mississauga was discontinued only in 2017. So we're not dealing with ancient history here, just a place that has moved around a little bit. So the only reminder of the name Todoraka, again, Toronto Township Recreation Day Camp, the only reminder of that name is now the leash-free park, Todoraka Park, up in northwest Mississauga, north of Dairy Road, located at 2725 Meadowville Boulevard. A favorite for dog walkers and dog enthusiasts and the like, but it has an older history. It's a fascinating element of kind of the one of the early vestiges, in name at least, of the forerunner of the city of Mississauga, that being Toronto Township. So again, next time you go to Todoraka, for any of our dog walkers out there, you might remember a little bit more of what the connection to that place name is on our modern landscape. So again, thank you for the question. Always fun to step back and look at name origins of places within our landscape. Our next question on Ask a Historian is on a Truscott Drive and whether or not there's a connection to a member of the royal family. In short, no, not a member of the royal family, but there is, in passing at least, a connection to royal matters, if you will. Some suggest that Truscott was named in honor of an early farmer in this area that lived here in the 1830s and 1840s, whose name was George Truscott. It's possible, but unlikely, given that there is such a short-lived and historic connection to that family name in this area. He sold property here in 1836, so very early on, some 120 years before the modern subdivision of Park Royal was created. However, the creation of Park Royal under the United Lands Corporation in the 1950s and brought some associations to royal place names, or the connections to the royal family. Part of Highway 122 through the subdivision in the south end was renamed Royal Windsor Drive. Part of the town line south of the QEW, Queen Elizabeth Way, was renamed Winston Churchill Boulevard as part of this subdivision as well. Of course, that name now connects throughout Mississauga and beyond. But there were certainly these connections of making the place name of Park Royal, even again royal in its name, the Park Royal subdivision by the United Lands Corporation, trying to connect to things royal or things British, if you will. And to that end, they tried to attract a member of the royal family to oversee the opening of this residential subdivision in historic Mississauga. They didn't get a member of the royal family. However, there was a trade mission or a trade conference going on in nearby Toronto Toronto in the summer of 1958, and they managed to coordinate a visit by the Lord Mayor of London, England, Sir Dennis Truscott, to officially open the subdivision. There was a sculpture that was unveiled with an official ribbon cutting and an unveiling, a big cloth covering the sculpture. The sculpture remains near the intersection of Southdown Road and Truscott and Wiseman Court. Sorry, so Southdown Road and Wiseman Court. One of our oldest, if not the oldest, pieces of public art within our community, and perhaps we can explore the meaning behind that sculpture in time. But this sculpture was unveiled and the subdivision officially opened again by the Lord Mayor of London, England, Sir Dennis Truscott, on August 9th of 1958. Much more likely that the name Truscott Drive takes its name from that connection to Sir Dennis Truscott. So again, you're not far off on your associations between Park Royal and a member of the royal family. There were associations, but again, Truscott Drive itself most likely named for Sir Dennis Truscott, Lord Mayor of London, England. Again, just fascinating elements of our story of how things get named and the origins of place names and how they connect to different elements of our history. So keep exploring the history of Park Royal. There are other older things within the community that predate the 1958 subdivision, and perhaps we can explore some of those in a future episode. So happy sleuthing. Our last question this week on Ask a Historian is from Susan from the Mississauga Writers Guild, and she has the fascinating thing about asking about a unusual or unique fact about the city of Mississauga. Rather than give you just a standard answer, I decided to have some fun with this one, and I threw it out there to many of my colleagues and co-workers and people I've connected with over the years in the community and local culture and museums and historical societies and the like, and I've had a tremendous response. What I asked for was what's the first thing that comes into your mind as a quick unusual fact about Mississauga, and I left it up to them to kind of figure out what was unusual to them, and the response has been incredible, and I think you've created a new little segment for us in Ask a Historian. Every episode or every couple of episodes, I think I'm going to include some of these quick did you knows about Mississauga and what some local historians and heritage professionals and incredible volunteers that work in the culture sector in our city have come back to me with in terms of what they find is an unusual fact. But just off the top, also thank you to those that contribute to this and probably will continue to contribute to this. An amazing array of answers so far. We're just going to touch on a few of them this week, and in future episodes we'll look at some more. But so just in the vein of unusual facts for Mississauga. The first one is from Dave, and I've always felt that people consider Mississauga nothing more than a suburb of Toronto. The Gage Canadian Dictionary defines the word suburb as a district, town, or village just outside or near a city. Well, Mississauga is the 6th largest city in Canada and the 3rd largest in Ontario, and yet many people still consider us a suburb of Toronto. Yet by the definition of a suburb, we are much more than that. Our next unusual fact, if you will, is from Nick, and remarking on an image from the 1920s of the Cooksville Brickyard Company, Cooksville Brick Company. Most pictures associated with the company show the significant scale of the operation, largely set up in the middle of nowhere in rural Toronto Township, just outside of Cooksville, around what is now Dundas and Mavis Road. Established in 1912, but nonetheless in the 1920s, the Cooksville Brickyard became the largest supplier of brick in Canada. One of the pictures features a giant claw reaching into a molten pit. It seems like something out of a dime novel or pulp magazine. You'd expect that in a massive steel mill or something along those lines, but it's altogether unexpected for people dealing with clay in the middle of nowhere in historic Mississauga. From Lindsay. In the 1850s, Mississauga had an abundance of wild fowl, birds. That was both a benefit as a food source and a problem as a destroyer of crops. The passenger pigeon migration over historic Mississauga numbered in the millions. In fact, witnesses at Niagara-on-the-Lake describe it taking over 14 hours for the flock to pass over the area because it was so many birds. It was so large. The pigeons were hunted for food and killed to protect crops. By 1900, they had been hunted to extinction. Also almost hunted to extinction was the Canada goose, which is hard to believe, but unlike the pigeon, geese were reintroduced to southern Ontario in 1968. Now, if you spend any time in Mississauga's lakeshore parks, you'll know that the reintroduction went oh so well, perhaps too well. The Canada goose overwhelmed land along the lakeshore in the GTA, and the city of Mississauga was looking for a solution to get rid of them. One of the results was shipping geese as part of their plan B, if you will, to relocate. And geese have ended up all over the nearby areas and farther afield. New Brunswick alone saw 2,000 Canada geese from Mississauga delivered there. And so one of these things where you're kind of fascinating when you think of just the people's interaction with the natural world and how it shaped their opinions and attitudes, but how we shaped it as well. From Tracy, one of my favorite stories I've come across was that of an octopus fossil found in Rattray Marsh in the 1980s. Very little information known about it other than the fact that it was found, but one of those oddities that make you wonder about bygone eras of days long past. From Stephanie, we got a couple. One, Randy Atwood, president of the Earthshine Astronomy and Space Science Organization, shared with me in 2011 that asteroid number 223950, discovered in 2004, was named for Mississauga. And you can view orbital information on the NASA website for the Mississauga asteroid. I had no idea. That's fascinating. Also from Stephanie, Benares Historic House has an unusual artifact. An ancient Egyptian shawabti. I think that's how you say that properly. It was found during an archaeological survey done at Benares in 1991. And it's not sure how the artifact ended there. It's wondering if it was originally acquired by the Harris family and later discarded. But this ancient Egyptian artifact might well be the oldest physical item in the city of Mississauga. From Scott, the Harris family of Benares, another Benares connection here, has connections to the Titanic and to Charlie Chaplin. Lucy Duff Gordon, who was on the Titanic with her husband Cosmo Duff Gordon, is a relative of, or was a relative of the Harris family. Her sister Eleanor Glynn, an early Hollywood screenwriter, was on William Randolph Hearst's yacht with Hearst, Charlie Chaplin, Marion Davies, and others when Thomas Ince was killed. So just, neat little things to larger events, niche connections, if you will, to larger events beyond Mississauga. For several, actually, if you want to count the one that has kind of the most hits so far on Unusual Facts, Becky Scott and multiple others as well. The story of Tootsie the elephant, who lost her life in a fire at Miles Park Farm in the 1940s, being buried in Mississauga. And we've talked about this before, but yes, indeed, there is an elephant buried in Mississauga. From Terry, Meadowva Village has a very impressive roster of distinguished artists who have painted scenes in the village and in the valley surroundings, in the Credit River Valley and along the banks of the Credit River. For such a tiny little place, little village, it's highly unusual to be able to point to so many accomplished, acclaimed, and prolific artists and painters who chose to paint there because what was viewed as the unparalleled beauty of the early community and its surroundings. The long list includes a group of 7 artists, A.J. Casson. Also, there was Fred Haynes, Georges Chavineau, Tom Stone, and many others. Truly remarkable, the artistic heritage of Meadowva Village. And from Hope, one thing that stuck out to me was learning that Mississauga had its very own theme song. Yes, indeed, Mississauga does have a theme song. From Hope, every time I hear it, it puts a smile on my face and brings back good memories of time spent in the city. It's the only city that I know of that has a song specifically written for it and not just about it. For those of you that are wondering, the song is entitled Mississauga by Tommy Hunter, and you can listen to it. It is posted on YouTube. So Mississauga by Tommy Hunter. Anyway, that's it for our first round of unusual facts in Mississauga. Thank you, Susan, for the question, and we look forward to visiting this topic in future episodes of Ask a Historian. So thank you so much.